Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. I know I shouldn't touch the mic right at the very beginning. Today, we're going to talk about two different races that were on Earth at one point in time, which was we're going to call them dwarf race, basically smaller humans, seemingly fairly proportioned, and then a tremendous amount of information, or at least proof, about a giant race. I'm going to start this off by telling you that there's absolutely no doubt that both of these existed. This is not up for speculation. And the reason being is that in both cases, we have this being documented by so many different independent moments in history that it's absolutely undeniable. And what we're going to get out of this is, one, the world was actually much more interesting in terms of intelligent beings, as well as continuing to reveal the fact that there are factions that are alive today and functioning today, not the individuals that started it and most likely did all these dastardly deeds, but that are suppressing the very history of the earth. And it sort of boggles the mind. Okay. So I'm debating about whether or not to go in this at the beginning or go into this at the end. I think it's more interesting to go into it a little bit at the beginning, which is to say, I know you haven't heard any evidence yet. There's a little bit of wind tonight, so we're moving out the hot air for some cold air for about 3 days, and then it'll get warm again. I'm looking at the audio track. Doesn't seem too bad. It's difficult to exist in a world where you're not the dominant race. Human beings, as we know it today, have not had to do that for a very, very long time. Perhaps only several hundred years as opposed to several thousand years. It would seem that the stories of the dwarf race, they ended earlier, just by a margin, technically, than the larger race. And you might say, well, that makes complete sense. The bigger one always wins. But the stories about the smaller races from the Native Americans especially, because they were in both major continent groups, the North Americas and the European, sort of Eurasian area, your mind's going to get blown. I mean, Magellan met these folks, okay? It was continued to be documented by several folks. The one rationale that just comes to mind is that, of course, we're pissed off nowadays because we have everything under control and we're like, come on, just tell us what happened. So you have one of two things happening here. You have a narration that these folks never existed and that we're a divine creation from God, and God never spoke of creating the other two races or the other two sizes that may have spun off at some point from our genetics. You look at primates, you've got all kinds of, you got from little tiny rhesus monkeys and little tiny monkeys all the way up to giant silverback gorillas, all seemingly related to each other at some mechanical level, all sort of a monkey-type skeleton form. Entirely and completely different in specificity from a human being, a Homo sapien sapien. As much as you look at it and you go, wow, they have rib cages, we have rib cages. They have skulls and we have skulls. Well, guess what? Everything else has it too. I mean, there's certain insects that resemble human beings. So whatever stuff we're made out of in general, and whoever's making us, and whoever designed us, is obviously whittling through a bunch of ideas. It doesn't mean we're the other thing, right? A dog has a rib cage and a spine and a skull and all the same little bones up to a point, and then it breaks off and becomes a dog. And just because one arranged itself to be similar to a Homo sapien sapien doesn't mean there's any connection. As I said several times, I was very skeptical about any theory that was against evolution when I was young. As I get older, I'm more alien drop-off or divine creation or both. Simply from doing, over 600 episodes of this content. I know our count's lower than that number, but my YouTube channel, which only has a couple ancillary videos, is up to 617. What do we have to learn from this? Perhaps the difference between what we did and what they did. Perhaps the history that is more fables and myth are actually true. But there was a point where man gained so much control over media and the control of dissemination of information that now, as we know, as we state several times on this show, we're living in a matrix. It's just we can't get out of it because we don't have enough citizens that are knowledgeable about this condensing of media control, which a lot of times we just think about television and internet, those standard networks that are on our TVs that are household words, but you have to understand all publishers of books were also consolidated. And I've been involved in that a couple times in some book efforts, and I'll tell you, the lattice of C Corps that make up these publishing companies is so messy that it's very difficult to discern. Some of you might have heard that little notification on my phone. I'm going to be working with a list of tremendous amounts of data here, so I got to read off something eventually here, just in terms of little bullet items. But I always tell you that I get tons of notifications from people all day long with their latest conspiracy questions or what they think is the truth. And that was one of them. So let's dive in. And then, I've got this list of bullet items here. And we're just going to go through it. And we'll elaborate. Now, the Americas are one location where, in America, being American, can jump off into this storyline. However, the Europeans also, at various stages in the same time frame I'm going to start in, which is the 1800s, had also found their indications that this stuff existed. But what was interesting is you have the occupation of Europe going back, at least easily 2,500 years, where you've got Roman control. So as these things were discovered, they were probably discarded without, a tremendous amount of documentation because man could barely read and write his own name. I mean, man didn't learn phonetic language for a really long time in terms of the masses. That's why the Greeks and the Romans who went to universities and all these popular philosophers were so powerful as people because they got to go and converse, and write down things and read things and learn things that were written down. Most folks in Europe, like my ancestors, and your ancestors, if you're from there, all places on earth, basically, there was just this point where there's reading, what's reading? And then it was like the elders had a hard time learning. The kids just took to it like nothing, and it changed their entire world. So the 1800s is sort of when America got a chance to focus on America and not fight revolutionary wars. Now we have civil wars and that kind of stuff on its way and happening in between some of this stuff. But there's a place called Hillsboro in Tennessee. It's in Coffee County. It's on the James Brown farm. This is where you have 6 acres of land that was described as anytime someone was digging a cellar, a water well, excavating land to agriculturally develop it, they started running into these weird tombs. And the way that this is arranged is you have something called blue limestone, which is not natively from that area. And they would create like slate rocks. And if you want to measure it in your brain as you're listening to this or watching this, think about rocks that are about 18 inches. They're about maybe a couple inches thick. They're a square or a rectangle. And they would line these things around in a rectangular fashion. And inside, so they're digging around the land and they immediately bump into this rock that's on top. It's sort of a cover. Now the tombs aren't enclosed like nice little caskets or anything, but they would lay a stone down as the floor. They'd put some around them and put a little cap on top. And bugs and everything could totally get in there. And what they found were, in the first dig, was up to 100,000 of these little tombs. And inside you have beings anywhere from 18 inches tall to 3 feet tall, either buried in a laying down position or a standing position. And we know of graves in South America where they dig those straight cylinder holes down into the ground, and then they bury a being, a tribesman of normal height down into there in a kind of crouch sitting position, and they put a top on it. These folks were known as the moonite people. I'm not sure where that term comes from. Obviously, they're dead and gone, so in terms of what they actually referred to themselves as is something completely different. And that's kind of a screwball thing for the brain. Sometimes you'll hear historical things over years, and they'll say, those are the Celtic people, but they didn't call themselves the Celtic people. In fact, the word Celtic means pretty much any language other than what was spoken on mainland Europe. And so as Rome starts to infiltrate Great Britain from the south and bring Christianity, anything they found that wasn't speaking the native languages that had been developed in Europe, they were known as Celtics. And then, of course, you have your barbarians, which were given that designation because their language had a lot of the phraseology of bar. So bar was a common, syllable in the middle of their language. Now, next to Coffee County is another county called White County. This is where you come up with another roughly 100,000 little graves. And the first time I had ever read through some documentation on this, they said, it was just shy of 250,000 of these graves between Kentucky and Tennessee. And so again, in terms of denying this, it's a little nuts. Now, someone might say, okay, well, perhaps these are babies, little children, or something like that. The way that they determined that these were fully grown humans was that they looked at the skull. And I think most of you know that when a baby's born, the skull plates they're not completely formed, and connected together. They have cartilage between them and that little soft spot that has a little heartbeat on it. It's a little freaky, right? The reason why that is, just in case you don't know, is that the brain is going to continue to grow. And so if you lock down a baby's skull, you're going to get what's called a cauliflower skull. And some babies are born without any cartilage, and they die because their skull doesn't get out of the way of the brain. But it does push the plates up, and you get this really horrible situation. Now, every little grave in this Coffee County discovery had this little pint-sized container. And inside was a conch shell, C-O-N-C-H shell. But this one was transparent, but it also had sort of like different coloring on each side. And it was a recognizable shell, but it wasn't a shell that anyone had discovered in the real world. So in my estimation, it might have been something where they took a normal shell and treated it with something to get it to do this transparent thing. Either that or that particular species of the shell, the way that it secretes it and builds this calcium shell, might have been completely different by an animal that's no longer a fish that's no longer available to us today. But he said some of the skulls were just 3 inches in diameter. Just imagine that. I mean, that's a tiny human. Now, again, just remember, we have various species. There's little tiny things out there. A fully formed, intelligent being. Well, look at a rodent. Look at an insect. I mean, insects are microscopic little beings, but man, they got little brains. It's incredible. So the fact that we've got a small human, it's not surprising. And I'm going to tell you a story again that the OG listeners will remember. And this is something that is just come to mind while doing my research on this one. One of my grandmothers was a school teacher for 36 years. She taught 5th grade, I believe. And the students loved her, and they would often come by and visit her after all those years. And the routine for me to hear these stories was that I'd go there for lunch, and she'd be fixing me lunch or dinner, and she'd say, oh, the student came by today, and this is what they taught me. One of her students came to her, and he was suffering a medical condition, or was getting severe migraines. But he was a Top Gun pilot. So it was kind of interfering with his medical review. And they said that, or he told her, he goes, look, I was CAT scanned. My head was CAT scanned. And he goes, I have to tell you that they've discovered that my brain is about a third the size of the cavity of my skull. But I'm fine. I have a huge academic prowess. I've become a top pilot. I mean, I never had any issues until recently. And they said that the fluid imbalance, you know, the displacement of fluid. And I know that doctors are going to say that's impossible. But I just would note, look at hydrocephalic kids that have water on the brain where their skull gets gigantic. Perhaps his skull formed out of fluid and not out of brain pressure, brain tissue pressure. And my grandmother was not a tall tale person at all. I mean, my God, trying to get her to tell anything other than just factual stuff was very difficult. And that's why when she told me that when she was a kid, the only thing she ever told me that was nuts, where she looked at me like, please don't think I'm crazy, was that her and her sister in the teens, the night teens, she's born in 1912, so by 1920, she said that her and her sister would sit in the Kansas plain. She's from Erie, Kansas, and they'd watch these cigar-shaped vehicles fly over the farmland. And, you know, I'm looking at her like, it was the last thing on earth I expected her to say. So imagine someone like that telling you something, and you just kind of sit on a bus or something with a relative, and they just look at you and go, you know, when I was a kid, I saw this. And you're like, what? So the interesting thing about that is I could never explain, nor could I ever find any medical records of this phenomenon occurring of a small brain inside of a human being. Maybe you know. But imagine this is just a relic of some of this old DNA coming back, and the guy's got a fully fledged brain like these littler folks, which the Native Americans said were vicious little warriors. In fact, there's an old tale, I think it's the Cherokee, that said that they highly respected these beings because they were ferocious, and at one time 200 Cherokee warriors were slaughtered by these guys because they accidentally wandered into their land in the middle of the night. It also has been mentioned in tons of ancient lore over in Europe. We know that there are stories of leprechauns, gnomes, elves. The elves have a slightly different sort of supernatural capability, but then leprechauns are supposed to be able to find, you know, pots of gold. Gnomes, I'm not sure of what gnomes are supposed to do, besides protect your yard, I guess. But fairies and elves, there's probably two distinctions, right? The fairies are the ones that are supposed to have the wings. Elves are just elves, unless if you play Dungeons and Dragons. But there are articles written about these pygmies, and the New York Times, of all organizations, which we know today has a compromised integrity model. But we're assuming, and you know, a lot of it has to do with a local newspaper that writes the article, and the New York Times simply picks up the article to publish it. So even though it has a New York Times insignia on the article, it is actually written by a local group of folks. Now, some of you might say, oh, well, you know, it's just like UFO sightings. Once someone hatches this theory, then everyone sees UFOs. Maybe, except the Smithsonian, which is a very interesting organization, is known for picking up the actual found objects, the actual skeletons themselves. They would actually appease the people and publish something. But because, again, we're in a time in the world where something could happen 100 miles away from where you live, and you would never find out. Even though everybody 100 miles away is in chaos because something happened, or they're completely happy because something happened. We didn't have necessarily Telegram completely developed when a lot of these articles were written. And one of the first articles ever written was in July of 1820. But these articles are written for nearly 100 years, man. Especially the giant stuff. The giant stuff's going to dwarf, pardon the pun, the smaller race stuff in the later years. The other interesting thing was that, you know, we're trying to derive what type of people these beings were. And there's two direct documentation methods that we can talk about. which is the Native Americans talking about them. And then, of course, all the fables of Europe, which we're going to get to in a second. But, as I've said a couple times on the show, and as video games taught me a long time ago, especially Sid Meier's in his Civilization game, burial rituals are big. Burial rituals, especially complex ones and consistent ones, like these Tennessee graves, these Kentucky graves, to just name two of the biggest finds that we had documented. They cared about their dead. They cared about their people. And that's huge. That shows intellectual development. That shows also potentially a spiritual belief in something, just potentially, okay, that there's something after this life. There's no guarantee. But burying them with that little shell was very interesting. Did everyone want one of those little shells? Why the shell? Maybe Demolition Man could tell us, right? So the stories of Herodotus, Homer, talk about this, pygmy race. And pygmy derives from the term cubit. And of course, a cubit is generally referred to as the distance between an average-sized human being's elbow to their wrist. About an 18-inch span in a lot of cases. But in those old fables, they talked about this valiant race of these pygmies that were highly developed. They were able to build structures. They were able to maintain their world. Everything that we do today, they're able to do as well. And for all we know, who knows if they came first, second, if they came at the same time. If you think about alien drop-off theories, then you have to entertain the notion that they built a big race, they built a medium race, and they built a small race, and just said, we'll see who dominates in the end. But they talked about them and made pottery and mosaics about them, fighting this giant race of storks. Which sounds a little nuts, but did you ever wonder as a kid when you watched old Warner Brothers cartoons and saw the stork with it was almost like a mailman hat on, but it's carrying your baby to your house? Why would a stork be carrying babies to your house? Well, if you are only 18 inches to 36 inches tall, apparently some races were 18, some races were 3 feet. Your babies would be well within the predatory food supply / ecosystem of a stork, I guess. I've seen storks, eat fish whole. And so I guess protein's protein and that kind of thing. But now imagine that a bundled up baby would be in some sort of container. Keep the baby warm. Maybe there's some wool or some sort of skin around it. And the stork runs off with that little parcel with a baby inside, then ends up landing or getting shot down with an arrow or something, slightly downwind, slightly down into a different village. So village A loses a baby, and village B captures the stork, and the stork drops the package. And the package insulates the baby from any impact and death. And babies are little rubber things, man. I've heard stories of babies falling off three-story ledges and hitting the ground and being fine because they're so spongy, But perhaps that yielded the legend of a stork delivering babies. I mean, I don't know of any other easily described methodology, because a baby, I suppose a stork could pick up a human baby, but man, it's like, how much could an unladen swallow carry between a line of creeper? It's one of those kind of equations. But this pygmy race is described by Egyptian lore, Ethiopian lore, apparently. And, one of the passages about this race and the troubles that they had, at least in the European / Eurasian sort of conglomerate over there, is that there was a arrogant queen of the pygmy race, and that the storks were actually being controlled by the Greek gods to sabotage them, first to divide them and then conquer them, to fracture them into smaller groups and then eventually eliminate them, which most likely was probably the way it occurred, because that's the way any race disappears, which is such a metaphor for today, right? The other one is that we have these structures. We have caves that have been found that housed what we call troglodytes. And troglodytes is a term for any being that's living in a cave, especially humanoid beings. And so I was surfing around, and I'm doing all this little research for this thing. And, all through the Americas, we have developed caves. And most of the time, we'll have a Native American story embroidered on top of caves. Many of you have actually commented about that in the comments over the years, and you say, do you really think that Native Americans lived in caves? And the only answer I can say is my hometown has a very famous Indian cave, an Osage Indian cave. But we have all kinds of Native American tribes in America, from Cherokee to just tons. But the kids, we all went down to this cave, and there was actually a chimney that was carved into the cave. It must be 15 to 20 feet straight up to let the fire smoke go out of the cave. And the authorities had to put a little grate on top of it because kids were falling through this damn thing, getting stuck. The only rationale for the cave, it would be wintertime, or maybe super duper hot summer, because, man, it was hot. I mean, the Midwest gets very, very warm in the United States, like 105 degrees for months. And so that would be the only thing I could think of where you sort of maybe put up some barriers. But the caves in my area are always built next to a creek. So you have a water stream supply for washing and bathing. There's not much fish. But the other one is that on this stream, and I can tell you the Smithsonian did not stop by my hometown and steal everything. So there's just absolutely tons of arrowheads that people found. Now, it's been picked over for so many decades that today, if you found an arrowhead there, it would be miraculous. But I mean, teachers will go down for a whole weekend. It's only like a couple miles out of town, and find these things. But we have these caves. Some of them have little tiny steps up to little tiny holes. And you're thinking, well, who could fit in that hole? I mean, are you going to really stop digging? If you have the mechanism to dig, are you going to dig a hole that's maybe 4 feet tall? No, you dig a 5 foot or whatever, just a little bit over your own height. And we met the Native Americans and documented them in photographs and stuff, and they were average height people. So it doesn't seem like they would have natively been the ones to do it. But I mean, this thing goes from the Himalayan mountains to the Philippines, Indonesia. I mean, it's everywhere. And the other one is that we have this, this romantic theory that's been around for a long time about a Middle Earth. J.R. Tolkien was big on Middle Earth. And, it could split into two different abstracts about Middle Earth. You could have one that is truly this other layer of Earth in the center. It's not complete. It doesn't go 360, whatever shape you think the place is, right? Because, it's caves. It's got, the bottom layer's got pylons that hold up the top layer and that kind of stuff. But if you were a human being in ancient times, say even 200 years ago, and you're finding a cave, you're born over here, you don't have this aristocratic background where you've seen developed cities, you've just seen log cabins and things, and you go down inside this stuff and you find that it was a logical place for civilization to hide during extreme weather conditions. Remember, like the Shoshone Indians, they went in a big circle with the weather until the Mormons showed up and slaughtered them all. So if you were a stationary tribe, then you got to hide from the elements. And a cave would be a great place. Everybody knows when you build a house into the side of a mountain, or into the ground, you've got a natural stabilization of about 65 degree temperature. So if you add anything else to it, fire, cloth, leathers, you're going to really be able to control your environment. And you still venture out to kill livestock, bring it in, slaughter it, cook it, that kind of stuff. So the other thing too is and I know that you guys know this, but it's good to remember, when you have children, you discover a little magical element of how we tell stories. If you took a kid, for instance, and you didn't raise them on television, for instance, and you said, okay, I'm going to take you someplace wild. It's going to be amazing. Put a little blindfold on them. And either you take them to Disneyland, you take them to the Harry Potter world, Legoland or whatever, but you put a little blindfold on them so they don't see the process of buying a ticket and entering this facility. You just take the blindfold off the second that they're inside Tomorrowland, and you say, you ready to go to the next world? Put the blindfold back on, take them to Frontierland, open it up. They're going to think that there's multiple worlds that they could exist in. And then if you were to take them back into the car on a blindfold, take them home, and have them explain that story to people, think about how tall the tail would be. And it's based on real observations. So now take man, dial back the intellect of man, I mean probably 250 years plus, and put them into these various situations where they're finding these artifacts, but they don't have any idea what the heck they're looking at. The tail of Middle Earth could be gigantic, even though it is not necessarily Atlantis stuck in some cave somewhere in Missouri. But when you see little tiny steps going into little tiny hobbit holes, you just have to give it, sort of a critique of what you're exactly seeing. And don't try to let the ego of man dismiss it because you're like, nah, this can't exist. Look at us. We're the number one species here. They can have existed. That might take away some of the discoveries that we did. I know you guys don't do that, but there are definitely folks that do. And we'll talk about those at the end here. So, in northern Great Britain, on the outskirts of Scotland, there's something called the, I hope I'm saying this right, the Orkney Islands, and there's supposed to be like 70 of them. And one of them has something called Hobbit Island. And so a lot of folks don't get to it because it's an island, apparently. I've never been there. But they have they have several of these little hobbit villages. And, they say they date back to 8,500 years. Who knows? Who knows? But they are teeny tiny little inlets into the ground where the doorways are about 4 feet tall. It's made of sort of a slate rock with, stacking slate. They're extremely intelligently made. Crazy. Now, what's happened is the roof that was over most of these installations has come off, whether it was wood pillars with leather or some hatching on top. What they think happened was that as the weather changes, because it does, hey everybody, the sand came in and washed over these and preserved them, and then we found them and dug them up. A couple cool things about this little location. I'll try to put some photographs of this up there. Tourists go and look at it all the time. It's just weird how these amazing things exist, like Coral Castle exists, and you never hear about it. Why? I can understand maybe like the Winchester house in San Jose. The crazy lady was the Winchester wife. She thought that all the souls of the Winchester rifle deaths were haunting her, and she got into mysticism and apparently paganism and devil worship and all kinds of stuff. She had seances. If anybody wants to contest, she was not into Satan worship. I've been there 6 times at least. Took photographs there several times, even though I wasn't supposed to. And this chick was obsessed with 13, everything demonic. It's really strange. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure she had a big Christian heart. Mm-hmm. But this one's cool. This Hobbit Island's cool. You go inside one of the entry points, and they strategically made the hallways kind of snake in sort of a turning motion, which some folks believe, and I think quite accurately, by studying the way wind would go through this, that it actually breaks down the actual wind coming in the door and chilling the occupants inside. Now, if they sealed the whole thing off, then wind would have a pressure problem going in, but zigzagging the hallway actually helps out a little bit as well. But every single one of these dwellings had a little campfire installation in the center with a sort of bigger throne with a bunch of little thrones, like little rocks you could sit on, but one's a little bit bigger. And of course, they theorized that maybe the chief would sit on that and warm himself up. Around there seems like a place for compost. There are little inlet, sort of bunk bed areas. They've even found shelving in one of these little inlet areas, as if it was kind of like we put our stuff in the little shelf Pretty cool. And there's a bunch of these installations there, in the ground. That's all manicured grass and stuff like that. So I'm sure they went out and hunted, did their thing, came in. The 4-foot tall entrances, well, you're going to want some clearance for your head, aren't you? That means that these are most likely some derivative of the pygmy race. And they called these people like the pre-Picts. The Picts were a race that was in Scotland that apparently are normal-sized people. And the Picts were the reason why Rome couldn't completely overcome Scotland area, which is really kind of cool, right? Rome was pretty powerful, right? And it's called Skara Brae, if you want to look it up. Skara Brea, I believe. Skara Brae. They thought that within this particular region, they could account for about 100 people living in the areas that they've discovered, which again, to us sounds like nothing, but to a village, that's a pretty damn good size. And considering that, they counted the rooms and thought, okay, if you had a family, like the Charlie Bucket kind of family, where you've got both grandparents, maybe some aunts and uncles, and then the current family that's younger and providing, that's about the size of the biggest one. They discovered this little hobbit island in 1850. And they think that it had been dormant for at least 4,000 years. So again, all these dates, they're speculative. Part of it has to do with, as well, that the fact that the Picts, the normal-sized Picts, average-sized people, were in that area by the time that it was discovered and started to document some of the wars that Rome was having with this area. They also found in the local region sort of a thinner version of like Stonehenge-type rocks without the T-bar thing. When studying the placement of these rocks, they realized that these folks had full grasp of summer solstice and the winter solstice, the winter equinoxes. And you need to know that every time you hear that, and you might be going, why do you guys always obsess on the winter and summer equinoxes, meaning the archaeologists? The reason why is that it is sort of it's an agricultural almanac to when you're supposed to plant and when you're supposed to harvest. When you're in sync with nature, then you have life and you have growth within these villages. So that's why it's so important. Here's what's wild about that little correlation, just in case you didn't pick it up. The more structures you will find in ancient history that have the alignments, there'll be pillars and, pyramid windows or whatever that can figure this stuff out, you'll have a bigger and bigger culture because they just simply know how to kick off the harvest. Now, one of the last stories about this pygmy race, before we go off to the giant race, is found in San Pedro Mountains in Wyoming. And the native people were called the Crow people, which were a Native American tribe. And they discovered a mummified human that was very, very small. And things shrink a little bit with age, of course, with mummification, of course. Don't confuse it with people who shrink heads. They shrunk heads by pulling the skull out of the encasement of skin and then putting something else in there and then sewing it smaller. That's how you have the Beetlejuice head at the end of the movie. That's not shrinking the skull. When I was a kid, it was so bizarre to go, how do you shrink a skull? How do you shrink a head? It's a head shrinker, right? Hollywood has a lot of shrinks. But when they studied the bones aging, which they called the character Pedro after the San Pedro Mountains, they discovered that his pelvis and the skin and the overall aging of the body was probably in its 60s. They ended up putting him in a jar and putting him on display, which was Rasputin's phallus is in a jar somewhere in some bar in Europe. It's nuts, right? But the Crow people, when this little Pedro character was discovered, this is when they started asking questions and got the story about these formidable people that were tiny, this tiny race. And someone came in and paid a tremendous amount of money for Pedro's body. and no one has seen it since. And the last time they checked, there's a $10,000 reward if you could find Pedro's body. Now, before we close out the tinier race, it was described, just for your full spectrum sort of picture in your head, that some of these were very proportional, small people, and some of these had hominid DNA in them, apparently. And so they did distort in different areas of the world, where some of them are painted very proportional in some of the mosaics and pottery paintings of Europe, and some of them were painted with very small legs, but very proportional. I mean, not anything, it didn't look like what we call in modern day time as dwarfism. But isn't it interesting that we now have a dwarf race as we have it here today? And you wonder, like, well, how would that happen? And, you know, they'll tell you various medical reasons why it occurs, right? Sometimes dwarfism is not a factor of you're really going to remain smaller, like the guy from Fantasy Island. I always forget his name. His name's hard to say. But the smaller guy from Fantasy Island, first-class dude, man. He had the problem where he was utterly, proportionally super tiny, but his organs continued to grow. And so he was always in a tremendous amount of pain his whole life because it was just pushing on his insides the whole time. Ricardo Montalban talked about, his character's name was Tattoo. But Ricardo said, you know, he was a gentleman the whole time, but every time I got him, you know, off the set and we were hanging out in between takes, you know, he would be agonizing with his thing. He's in an episode of Taxi, as a matter of fact. And when he walks onto the set of Taxi, they don't do anything to offset the camera, and there's just average height people in that show. And you really get the sense of how utterly tiny this guy was. And again, man, he wore 3-piece suits, and he was just apparently just one of the sweetest souls on planet Earth, and the ladies loved him, which I think was awesome. So even within their construction, there's a lot of different types of them. And in the mosaics and the paintings in Europe, they're usually rendered as being fairly sort of medium complexion between, well, like brown, you know. So I don't know if the ones in the North Americas were of any pigment. We don't really know. If we could find one of those skeletons, I'm sure we could sample the skin and get an idea of sort of the pigmentation of their skin, which I think would be fascinating, because when we get into the giants here in a couple seconds, there is going to be a story by the Native Americans that said there was a black-bearded giant race that was always hospitable, but then a red-bearded race came in and killed the black-bearded race. I'm inclined to believe it all, at least as a sort of binary story, fairly factual. If anyone's trying to tell me what, you know, what they thought mentally or something, I'm going to measure that with a grain of salt. But those basic stories, there was this race came in and killed that race, that's pretty flat story. I tend to believe that, and it's not necessarily a mythical thing either. They didn't say they came from spaceships or something, right? Someone commented in the comments today, I haven't investigated this, but he said that, I think it's a he, I'm not sure, 96% of you are he's, have a 96% chance of being correct here. But he said that the word Cairo actually stood for the god of Mars, which is very interesting. And if any of the photographs of Mars are actually real, there's pyramid complexes in Mars, and we have pyramid complexes here in Egypt. Interesting, right? So moving into giants. The way I'd like to kick off the giant segment of this episode is to say that Abraham Lincoln was at a Niagara Falls gathering, and he gave a speech. And of course, he was 6'5", which was pretty damn tall for that time frame. And he just had unique genetics, didn't he? I mean, there are people who look like him today, but there's the guy that did the Twilight Zones of him was a remarkable likeness of Lincoln. He also played Gabriel in one of the episodes. But Lincoln was very interesting and obviously super cerebral. He had that Martin Luther King gene where he could just walk up and riff a speech out that then becomes utterly legendary. sometimes writing it down and sometimes just pulling it out. But in his speech to the Niagara Falls group, what he was saying was that these falls have always been here. He said when, Christopher Columbus discovered America, these were roaring. When Jesus was being hung on the cross, these were roaring. When Moses parted the sea and freed his group from the desert, from the Egyptians, these were here. And he says, even when Adam and Eve were being put on this earth, these were here. And then he laments, even before Adam and Eve, the giants that founded this continent were observing the Niagara Falls. This is Abraham Lincoln, man. Very interesting, right? I mean, here's the president of the United States at a time when you could actually walk into the White House and say hi. First articles that are written are in the 1820s, 40 years before this dude gets inaugurated. So probably read things and added it to his fabric, right? His historical nature. And as we kind of get into the giant thing, if you follow my other episodes, you'll know that Einstein was a creation from outside forces to take almost an abject moron and make him a genius in the eyes of the people through press. Go see my episode on Einstein and then go see my episode on Tesla. Between those two episodes, you're going to get everything you need to understand what he was doing. But Einstein was put in place to erase a ton of technology so that you have to buy electricity for the rest of your life. Had Tesla been left alone and finished his Wardenclyffe Tower, everything would have power without any wires. There'd be no power stations per se. There would be Wardenclyffe Towers, probably highly refined at this point. We'd have zero-point energy everywhere. Doesn't mean, we would potentially allow infinite energy to go in all directions. There's still a limited amount of electricity that you'd have available for any one device. So you wouldn't be able to power your flux capacitor, but anything that's going to run off 110 or probably 220, what is it? No, it's 240 in Europe. You could get it. Maybe through capacitation and other techniques, you could run your warehouse and what have you. So Einstein was used to take us off the scent. But who else in this conversation has been used to take us off the scent of all of this history? Darwin. Darwin is why we have paleontology, the study of dinosaurs, this fake movement. Go see my episode on dinosaurs. Again, the first two gentlemen who worked on dinosaurs lied for 40 years, said they discovered 136 species of dinosaurs, 32 of which today are the only ones that they say actually exist. And of course, when Steven Spielberg needed a new thing, we got the Velociraptor. When everyone got tired of Tyrannosaurus Rex, they found a bigger one. It's just a Hollywood production, man. Sorry to ruin your story. You've never seen a real dinosaur bone in your life, ever. No matter how many history museums you ever go to, you're looking at replicas of someone's chicken bones, man. So Darwin was there to erase any possibility of these two other races existing, sort of indirectly, of course, and to establish that supposedly we come from primates, monkeys. Well, here's a crude analogy. When you mix up the dough for a cake, the batter for a cake, and you put it in the oven, and it's done, do you pull out the cake and then you still have dough? Or still have batter? No, the batter turns into the cake. When a caterpillar puts itself inside of a cocoon and turns into a butterfly, is there still a caterpillar left? No. Things evolve, and then the old thing goes away, and the new thing exists. To use their science against them, there's 32 skulls of hominids, 150 million years of nothing, and then all of a sudden you have Homo sapiens sapien totally redesigned away from hominids and hominid skull next to it, which is sort of like your Yeti Bigfoot thing. But you're from a monkey. I'll spare you the retelling of De Lamarck, but go read the book. I said the name wrong. The Wisdom of the Cells is, I think, the book by Bruce Lipton. Once you read that book, he'll teach you about De Lamarck, the French scientist who discovered true epigenetics, didn't call out any exclusivity towards man and primates and all that kind of stuff. And when Darwin couldn't figure anything out, he's a rich kid, he's an aristocratic child on his boat his daddy bought him. Battle of Waterloo, they discover De Lamarck's stuff, give it to Darwin. Darwin's an idiot, and so he boils it down to something we already knew, which is survival of the fittest. So the best way to tell you about the giants is to tell you about all the articles that were written and published, well, written by one group and then published by the New York Times. The only one that I know is natively probably a New York Times production is about a group of guys that were excavating in New York City who found a bunch of large humans. Now, I need to correct something that perhaps I've mentioned because I've watched too many videos on YouTube. The giant human rumors are largely out of sync with the documented giant humans in one specific way. In all the articles that I have harvested from the time in which we were finding them and documenting them, and the Smithsonian group comes and picks them up, and then they write about them, and then all the remains disappear, probably sent to Europe, probably the Royal Academy of Sciences, which is sort of the regulators of perceived reality, was that somehow there were human beings that were 25 feet tall. In all of the articles that I have read, you're going to see here, we're just going to go through them real quickly, and then we'll lament about various ones. The tallest human being in any one of these articles was 12 feet tall. Now that's tall, okay? The average height that they were talking about was usually around 8 to 10 feet, somewhere in there. Lots of sevens, and of course, we have 7 feet tall people playing basketball every single day. A couple 8-footers, right? My grandmother met, because the dude came to my hometown, that little town I keep talking about, right? That tallest man in the United States, which I think was about 9'2". He came to my hometown because that's the way he raised money to live, because he wasn't able to work because his body didn't work well. He came and posed, and of course he puts his hand over people's heads and that kind of stuff. And the guy's like half a torso taller than the tallest guy in the entire town, you know, plus his head. So my grandmother got to meet that guy, my other grandmother. So it would seem that the gene pool of the giant human still exists. And again, one of the things that I didn't read about in any of these articles was the double row of teeth that they said that giants had. You have your row of teeth, and then just dial back a few millimeters, and you got a whole nother row of teeth. When I was a kid, when I moved from Germany to Kansas, back to my parents' hometown, there was a kid on the block. And I remember this vividly. One summer afternoon, the kids say, "Hey, man, show him your teeth. Show him your teeth." And it's just a normal-sized kid. And this kid, I don't think stayed in our hometown, because I think he would have been an anomaly. And I don't know, these are his baby teeth, right? But he's probably about anywhere from 5 to 7 years old. But the dude leans back his mouth and shows me the under part of his teeth. The dude had 2 rows of teeth. Interesting, right? You know, that went in my mind. It was a little anomaly for the months that were there. Didn't really think about it again. And then when I heard about these giant humans having 2 rows of teeth, I was like, oh my God, I saw a kid like that when I was a kid. Dormant genes that are still floating around. Potentially, right? Now, the years on this are going to correspond with the way I ingested them, so sorry I haven't sorted them chronologically. So one of the articles was written in 1883. It talked about mastodonic remains being found in Brown County, Ohio. They didn't offer any dimensions, but they would say, if they didn't say 8 feet, 10 feet, 7 feet, they would say usually about double the size of man. Now, obviously, if your average height is 6 feet, which I don't know in the 1800s, because I know by the mid-1950s in America, we had health all figured out. We were getting average height, 6 feet, because our police officers in the United States had to be 6 feet tall for quite a few decades before they ended up piercing that and letting shorter folks become police officers. It was all just about being a big guy so that you could do the job and push people around, because people didn't, pull out AK-47s back in the day. You just grab them and say, stop that, right? In 1835, a guy named Samuel Miller had a dig where he found several 7 feet people. 1806, a guy named James Wofford talked about his grandmother saying that the Native Americans in his region told his grandmother that there was this race of gigantic human beings, and she added one little distinction, that they told her that they were pretty much normal but gigantic, and they had slightly slanted eyes. Talk about aliens, right? And again, remember, there's all these artifacts in I think both Africa and South America where you have very alien-looking almond-eyed creatures, which are very, very rendered, very majestic and sort of, king and queen-like. Another article from the 1888 village of Cogné, gigantic structure, 4 acres, bunch of gigantic skeletons found. 1858, giant bearded men discovered. Remember the story about the Blackbeard I told you, being conquered by the Redbeard? That story came out of a group from 1858. 1897, New York Times, Maple Creek, Wisconsin, gigantic-sized human found 9 feet tall. And the other thing, too, is that they were found usually with massive weapons, implements, and that kind of thing. 1885, article by the New York Times, 7 foot tall creatures found by some schoolboys. And it was found in a large stone vault, which actually had a stone floor. And so they also had like partially burned bones, beaded necklaces, 80 stones, this pipe that was really wild looking. And they said that the knives that they would find actually had a lot of craftsmanship to them. So they were curved to seemingly do a better job killing, bleeding out the animal, that kind of thing, like we have today. When you get a good hunting knife that's got the inlet on the blade to let you can stab an animal and bleed them out, because it's going to go inside that groove, the grouting in the blade. But this pipe had, encrusted, it had like reliefed artwork of animals fighting each other. Very interesting. It's a very developed mind to say, I'm using this to kill animals, let's carve something on it, which then you have to get the artistic capability of carving the likeness of something, which means, ask anyone who does carving or sculpting, they were an artist first. They were able to draw something on a piece of paper first, typically. 1882, giant skeletons published by the New York Times in Red River Valley. Dozens and dozens of these things taken away by the Historical Society and never to be seen again. And the one that's probably native New York Times article was in 1904, where a bunch of men were building the Purdy Station and just found a bunch of skeletons. 1902, New York Times in New Mexico, a bunch of guys had found 12-foot humans in Guadalajara. They said the teeth got as big as walnuts. One of the findings said that one of the skeletons had teeth and a jaw so giant that they could probably bite a coconut open. Not saying it did, it's just that's how big these mouths were. 1883, New York Times published an article about Charleston, Virginia, and it was a single 7-foot chief with copper bracelets and all kinds of ornate stuff on it. New York Times, 1916, 68 men with an average height of 7 feet, dating back, they estimated, around 700 years. They had massive axes. They were gifted to the American Indian Museum, never to be found again. 1880, New York Times published an article about a guy, about an incident in 1796. So we're talking about almost 100 years, 90 years or so, where they said they found 11-foot, 8-inch tall skeletons, and a bunch of judges from the area came down to observe this excavation, and they said that as soon as they started lifting the bones out of the dig, they crumbled into dust. Now, some of you might accurately say, well, maybe that was a hoax because you could just put clay or something, you just basically sculpt it, and then as soon as you pick it up, it falls apart. I tend to believe the actual judgment of this because they said that the judges came home and were like, we got to document this before it goes away. 1912, New York Times, Lake Delavan, 18 7-footers are found with sloping foreheads. 1871, New York Times, huge Native Americans were found in Virginia. Skulls with 1-inch thick bone, 8 to 9 feet tall. San Antonio Express in 1939. Now, it's getting pretty late, right? The giant skull, twice the size of a human being, was found. Now, if any of you know Andre the Giant, his skull was probably on average twice as big as any human on Earth. And of course, we know there's, in those cases, it could be one of two things. Of course, they would usually say like a thyroid problem could create infinite growth, and that does happen. Perhaps that one's just an anomaly. 1883, Providence Press, giant 12-foot high humans, femur bones 30 inches long. 1893, the Sun newspaper talked about in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, finding several skeletons that are 8 to 9 feet tall. 1904, St. Paul Globe, 11 foot tall, being found. 1908, New York Times, in Mexico, they find 200 skeletons over 8 feet tall. 1892 in England, they said they found a double-sized human. Now, the Smithsonian, because that's the end of the articles. I want to get to those quickly because I know they're not that entertaining. But I just hope that drives home the fact that these were highly publicized. If you talk about 1820 being one of the first articles, one of them mentioning an incident in 1796, of course, but the last article I just read to you was 1939. And we know that they're claiming to have found them in 2020 in South America. When they try to go back to excavate and measure and do laser scanning, the countries block it off. Somebody shows up in a black suit or something, right? So the Smithsonian comes together through a chain of events. There's a guy, Smithsonian or something like that. He's a very wealthy man. He dies in the early, kind of mid first quarter of the, maybe second quarter of the 1800s. He wills all of his riches to a relative of his. It might have been like a nephew, I think. And then he said, if that dude doesn't have an heir, then the whole thing goes to the United States of America. And of course, magically, that guy dies without an heir. I mean, dude, you're just signing a death warrant for that poor kid. Can you imagine that? It's tantamount to you have an uncle that shows up. He sits in front of a mafia of killers, super rich killers. And he says, okay, I'm giving all this guy the money, but if he dies without a kid, you guys get it all. I mean, wow, the naivete blows my mind. But he said that his charter, the original guy, was good. And his charter was to build an organization that would harvest all this natural history knowledge. And then his mission statement was to diffuse information to the world from his money and his investment. Now, the Smithsonian is the opposite in these key areas. Now, the Smithsonian does more good than bad in terms of holding down history nowadays. And I know that that's kind of a qualified statement. Again, my dad's Army buddy who participated in my life in very significant ways, his helicopter is now in the Smithsonian. Very key helicopter from Vietnam War. A war that shouldn't have occurred, of course. But it was reported, get this, man, old play card being pulled out today. It's like what I'm about to tell you is indicative of the same thing that we hear today, which is we have to hide everything for national security reasons. Again, there's a brilliant, I don't know what episode it is. Some of you might know. If you know, barf it into the comments because it'd be great. There's a Next Generation Star Trek episode where Jean-Luc Picard is told that by an alien race, and then he quotes some passage from, I think, the 1400s where he said, "Oh, you're playing that old card," and then he quotes this old thing, and he goes, "See, that's an old trick that our world did to get dominance over the people." But here's what the Smithsonian has done in the 1800s and the early 1900s, apparently. As this stuff started to disappear, and scientists back in the day, archaeologists, were going, hey, or anthropologists, I should say, were going, hey, where's all this stuff? Where's it going? The Smithsonian pulled out the race card and tried to say, oh, well, you're trying to diminish the Native Americans by talking about the giants. I don't know if there was a lot of protest about the little bodies being taken away, because the amount of those little bodies were not as proliferated as the larger ones, apparently. Now, we have one last eyewitness story, which is way better than the articles. And it has to do with Magellan getting to Patagonia. And this is 1520s, man. 1520s. When they were still alive, okay? So, here's Magellan. And for those of you who don't remember, he's a famous name, and you're like, what is that guy again? Was he the stargazer guy? No. Magellan was a dude, and especially if you played Civilization by Sid Meier's, you get to the Magellan accomplishment, and your boats can all of a sudden go deep into the ocean. He's the guy that started exploring the world. But he gets off the coast of Patagonia, and one of his crew members was assigned to document what they saw. And they said they saw a massive human being on the beach, naked, running around, dancing, and throwing dust in the air on his head in some wild ritual. And he was singing, and he was happy. And so, of course, the way the boats work back in the days, they didn't just pull him into a port, because there are no ports. So they get as close as they can. They anchor down, put a boat down. One of the crew members from Magellan's boat goes over to the coast, makes friends with this giant beast. There's no language between the two of them. And the goal, apparently, was that Magellan said, could you bring him on the boat so he could do that to us? Bless us with his ritual. I don't know if he was a mystic at some point. But the being, the big giant human being, gets on this boat. I mean, imagine that. Some gigantic being. They didn't say what size he was. He gets on, comes over, and starts doing the ritual. But then at some point, he takes his finger and he, kind of like a question face, points up to the sky. Like, are you from the heavens? That is so interesting, because it pronounces a belief that there are, in that giant tribe's mind, beings that are from the heavens, maybe? I mean, we're pretty sure they don't have Christianity in their system. They're not thinking about Peter and the book and all that kind of stuff. So they're pointing at the sky. He's pointing at the sky saying, are you from this higher place? And they don't really document that they said either way. But in 1579, this guy named Francis Drake, another popular little explorer, he discovers this race and says he comes back and documents, because this is, 1520s to 1579. So just think 1580, right? 60 years later, roughly, he comes back. Magellan's most likely dead and gone. I haven't looked up his death record, but he's dead and gone. And this dude comes back and says, Magellan was right. I found that race. He said they were huge in stature, incredibly strong. And he said that their voice was hideous. And what's interesting about that is we know of the famous actor who played Lurch. He played Jaws guy from the James Bond. He was in Happy Gilmore. He eventually passed. He had that massive, deep voice. And, was it Tony Robbins is 6'8"? He's got a pretty deep voice as well. But when you hit 7 feet, your vocal cords are gigantic. And so imagine if 7 feet's the smallest of these beings and you hit 12. What the hell would a 12 sound like? And the other one is like, how on earth would they communicate without having a written language between the two of them? In the 1590s, another boat comes over. There's really no mention of the captain. At least I didn't find that. And they said they had a hostile encounter with these giants. Another guy named John Byron, who's the captain of a ship called the Dolphin, in 1766, he said he ran into 10-foot tall giants. Same dude, in 1773, said he found 500 people in this one village. And he said that, and of course, this is after the Spaniards had brought horses over and they started procreating. But he said that a bunch of them were standing and a bunch of them were on horseback. I mean, were they Clydesdales? I don't know, man. Horses do have limits, right? I mean, you get a big fat person on a horse and there's a funny video on YouTube. And the last real reported one that I could find, and there's just so many. I mean, there's so many. And I skipped a bunch of articles where they didn't really say exactly the height of the folks because that starts getting boring. But if you want to find that stuff, it's out there and it's so plentiful. It's undeniable. But there's known as the Kentucky Giants, which is interesting because I don't know the story of the Kentucky Giants, but hearing Kentucky Giants coming from Kansas does sound familiar to me. But apparently in Kentucky, they did find 3 skeletons that were over 8 feet tall. Okay, where can we go from here now? Well, I got a couple for you. What is the overall sort of common denominator of pre-dynastic and pre-Inca construction? As Brian Forster, and Brian's name is spelled B-R-I-E-N, a little strange spelling there. He shows you from Baalbek to Egypt to Machu Picchu and a bunch of other locations, the huge stones are on the bottom, and those are the ancient stones, and then above that are little tiny stones that the average size folks put on there. And again, South America was littered with pygmies. When there's pygmy races in Africa, there's pygmy races all through South America. One of my employees, brilliant artist, was Aztec. Or sorry, he was Mayan, excuse me. He's Mayan and he was very short. But he had that build. His face looked like the statues of the Mayan statues. So 100%, you know, he's a shorter guy, but just built to last. But let me tell you. But now imagine you've got all these giant races. And one of the first stories they got the giant race story from is they find these gigantic tombs, literally, structures, and they'd ask the Native Americans, well, who built all this stuff? Some of this stuff is really giant. And they said, you know, there was a race before us, the giant race. Well, now imagine the pyramids that are in South America, gigantic stones, gigantic structures. Well, if you start developing proportionally strong human beings, not sort of like the thyroid human that's going to have a lot of functional problems because they're not supposed to be that large. They may be getting triggered by an ancient gene pool. But, you know, Andre the Giant died of suicide, basically, of alcohol. Unintentional, of course, we think. But he had aches and pains. I mean, it was the whole Hulk Hogan story, which is just so heart-wrenching and yet so amazing. Andre was an amazing human. But all those big, tall folks that you'll see videos on YouTube, they're struggling with how it feels to be gigantic. But if you were totally proportional, picking up a gigantic stone, maybe it's not so heavy to them because they're super duper strong. Again, we still lack all the documentation because they didn't have any. So maybe a bunch of these structures that we have found were built by these races and then inherited by the average folks later on. Now, in terms of why the larger race passed, it's probably very similar to the story about the dwarf race, except instead of the stories of Homer and the Iliad and talking about storks and fighting them off and the Greek gods punishing them and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they could have had a fight with, I mean, apparently they definitely had fights with storks. There's just legendary battles that are in sculptures and mosaics and documentation. But as to why that happened is probably more of a natural cycle than necessarily Zeus being up there punishing them because there's a woman in there tribe that was being arrogant to the gods. I mean, that's all humans have gone through that thought that they've angered the gods and that's why they're in a famine or having a plague or something, right? But in terms of the big ones, it's probably us simply overriding their territory. Who knows how dense the population of these beings would have become? Not sure. All the skeletons have been confiscated. Now, in terms of why the skeletons would be confiscated, again, like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, there might be a situation where if you're on Earth, and let's say this thing didn't end yet, and we still, right now in 2021, we had this dwarf race. I mean, we're talking different than our dwarfism, which can be caused by like Danny DeVito's disease, where he had bones that were very brittle when he was a kid. And so he kept breaking on him. Same with the Magic Mike who was in Carnival. Or you could just simply have the gene that's not letting you grow as much, right? But if we have giants as well, and there's a territorial problem. It's not necessarily like we have any personal problem with any of these beings, but the littler guys could be fearful that we're the average size today human. We're considered giants to them. And it's survival of the fittest, man. That's why Darwin was hardly profound in his insight. And so we fight, and we fight because we have to. As far as us beating the giants, my God, the only thing I could think of would be sort of woolly mammoth theories of us hunting as pack animals and taking out a woolly mammoth. The most fascinating story I ever saw about how Africans live in complete balance with nature in Africa is that what they do is they strike an animal so many times with spears that they bleed the animal out, as well as the fact that a lot of animals don't really have the ability to sweat like human beings. We don't have fur on our body head to toe. So imagine being so covered in fur, it's hot out, you're panting your tongue out, and as long as you're in control of your body, you're a leopard doing a hunting ritual, you're going to sprint, try to kill an elk, and then you relax and chew it down. But if you're being chased by humans, they chase the lion until it exhausts and it lays down and it pants, and they take the young warriors out that need to have a rite of passage, and they have to get the first spear in. Then the tribe throws spears at it, and they literally bleed the animal out until it dies, and then they harvest it. Interesting, right? Now imagine, instead of hunting down and potentially just killing these giants, we simply, like cancer, we just grow on the continent and they just keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back. If they're the more sophisticated society, they may choose not to kill us because they're more sophisticated and empathetic to life in general. And so they just keep going up in areas they've never been before until they get themselves to an area where there isn't any ecosystem for them to live. It'd be interesting to scour Alaska because it's hardly ever been touched by man. And there might be a ton of skeletons up there that haven't been discovered. Unfortunately, when people discover things today, they can't help but put it on social media, and then it blasts all over the net, and the black sheep show up, and it goes away. So if you ever find any of this stuff, keep it to yourself until you've got it stored in a public location where it can't be taken away from you. Then have a giant press conference. But there's one other thing I want to throw at you, because before I was made hip to the fraud of paleontology by Eric Dubé, Eric's his own guy, I'm my own guy. We don't believe everything the same, so don't accuse me and generalize either one of us and believing each other's stuff. I've never met the gentleman. But I think he's 100% correct with his assessment of paleontology, and he's not the first one to say. It's paleontologists that have 35 years experience that have never seen a real bone that broke the story. He simply harvested it beautifully in a documentary. Expanding Earth, which is what I believe, just go look it up on YouTube. Expanding Earth. Go watch Neil Adams' videos on it. In my opinion, it is so blatantly obvious, and it ties in with ethereal sciences, with electrical universe theories, which is just an expansion of ethereal sciences. The Earth was, at one point, when the crust was sealed, before we had the expansion of two primary cracks, one being the Atlantic Ocean and one being the Pacific Ocean, something you can see by just looking on Google Earth and looking at the center. Most contour maps of the world reveal these cracks. It's ejecting new plates at these seams because as more plasma energy boils and slows down and decides to be the various atoms that build up the crust of the Earth, plus space debris, which is probably a minor part of it all. The Earth expands, blows out the continents. I rewatched Neil's video and I forgot to mention one key thing that he said in there because I'd never really heard him say it. And now since I've said it to you several times, it made sense to me. When you look at the Atlantic Ocean, this is where the Pangea drift bogus theory comes in. One is, these continents are like on ball bearings and just floating on some other substrate. That's just so asinine. I hope that you didn't continue to believe that too far into your adulthood. Well, we can see that Europe and North America and Africa and South America butt up perfectly. You can see it. And the reason why is that the crust crack in the Atlantic is a lot stronger, potentially thicker than the one in the Pacific. And so it's closer for your mind to put the two together. And so you go, oh yeah, of course. And Pangea, yeah, sure, it's all up there and it was all over there at Europe's side. Because the Pacific is so gigantic, it's like 9,000 miles away on average, right? Your brain doesn't pull those two sides together. Plus, the way that it broke up, it made Australia and the Indonesian islands and Japan and Asia, it's less perfect until you really start to think about, okay, there's this huge indent in South America. That's where Australia goes, bank, right up in there. Again, if you take all the coastal regions on the longitudinal lines, on average, okay, things did turn a little bit. And there's a potential shift in the core of the Earth, which created this 23-degree tilt. Again, there are artifacts in South America that have summer solstice and winter solstice perfectly predicted, but they're 23 degrees off. It shows that this happened while man was on Earth, where you started building that little clock for the almanac, and then the Earth switched. All the temperatures would have rotated. Man, what a terrifying day that must have been. They theorized that could switch in like 2 weeks. Who knows? But, I mean, even if it did in 2 years, wow, you're living in the desert, and now all of a sudden it's the Antarctica, right? But on longitudinal lines, all the way down the Earth, foliage matches across the oceans, all the way down the Pacific Ocean. What we have in the northern hemisphere of North America and Canada is over there in Japan and Asia. Okay, so for me, it's pretty conclusive. But when you shrink the world down, you shrink the blockage of ethereal winds, which is what gravity is. Forget all this phenomenon crap you read about in encyclopedias or Wikipedias. Just go read the definition of gravity in any book, and you'll see the word phenomenon right in the title. Science doesn't have phenomenons, right? That's why they piss on religion, piss on God, piss on paranormal stuff, because that's a phenomenon. You're talking about something we can't explain, and there's not a machine that senses ghosts, so they can't exist, right? When you shrink the displacement of the Earth, you lighten the gravity on Earth. And so imagine the Earth is smaller, and it's actually a lot younger than you think. I mean, all this stuff about how old the Earth is, I just talked about that. It's ridiculous. That anybody knows, right? Try not to solve things that you can't solve. I mean, or at least put a little bit of qualification and some asterisks in your definition. People just like to be Jeopardy contestants, right? Well, we know it's this. Well, hey, 10 years ago, you were wrong. Anyway, when you have less gravity, you have a couple things that can occur. You have potentially the ability to have larger beings on this planet, which Neil believes in paleontology, at least when he made these videos. I don't know if he believes it anymore. But his explanation for dinosaurs was that they're allowed to exist because gravity is 1/4, because the Earth, when you seal up all the oceans, is 1/4. And I'll remind you, there were some German scientists that have nothing to do with any conspiracies. They reverse engineered the age of the ocean by looking and examining the amount of salt content that the ocean increases by every year. And they reverse engineered it down to 0. And they said, man, the oceans can only be 60 million years old. That's a long time, but man, in terms of how old we think the Earth is, that ain't much. Now, it is still, for me, a giant mystery how you would get 3 different distinct sizes of human beings, unless it's intentionally created. When you do study the Anunnaki history, they're, again, in my episode on Anunnaki is one of my worst episodes ever, but it's because I got frustrated with how bad the story is and how asinine gods are written within their lore. But they talk about the Nephilim being these giant human beings and that they were too rowdy and that the gods came down. And apparently we're always making too much noise, even though Anan, the main god, he's always in the stars and he won't have anything to do with Earth because he doesn't want to interfere with Earth. But we're making so much noise. It's just like the Earth's like this booming disco, man, just boosh, boosh, boosh. And he's like, God, shut up. And so he goes down and kills us all. Okay, whatever. But it might be, if you go with alien drop-off theories, then you would have them experimenting with 3 different sizes to see which one is more suitable. Could be when the Earth is changing sizes, we change sizes with it. And we also know, and I want to mention a Disneyland experience before I finish here, we also know that we're sort of birds of a feather flock together. Politically, that's a big thing right now in the world, but imagine you're a shorter person. You want to marry a shorter person. It's more compatible. And, before the internet, that was very, very much the case. And the only time you would find, at least in my personal history, my family, a really short woman marrying a very large man, it was sort of a protection, subconscious mechanism. You'll find that if a daughter has a problem with her dad, she will marry someone that could beat up her dad. It's a weird thing, at least visually in her mind, the bigger stature. If she's in a more formidable area like Brazil or something where gangs are killing everyone off every single day, young people killing young people, you'd want a bigger spouse to protect you. I had a good friend of mine, she's probably about 4'11", I think, 5 foot at the best, and her mantra with men was to date gigantic men. And every time you talk to her about these guys, it was always, she couldn't say anything to appreciate them as a human being, other than maybe to say like a general phrase of nice, he's nice. And she picked good guys. But she would always, like 9 to 1, always mention, how big and strong the guy was, and if he played football or whatever, or he beat a guy up. I mean, it was always the big thing of like, all right, we get it. You got a little problem here. You got a little short person problem. Just relax already, right? But I was at Disneyland a couple of years ago, probably about 2019, I think. I was in California Park. I was getting some ice cream at the Radiator Springs World, where it's like this, they took road cones and they turned them into ice cream buildings. And I'm sitting there. There's a little bit of a line, 10 feet. And I remember standing in line, you people watch like crazy when you're there. It's one of the most entertaining parts of the park. And I look over to my right, and I see it's a Latin family, and fully proportional humans, beautifully proportioned, really pretty women, a couple guys. And it was definitely 2 sisters and a mother for sure. And I think one of the daughter's husbands was there. These were the most tiny human beings I have ever seen in my life. And the most fascinating thing about it was 100% proportional. I wouldn't say, again, the classic definition I was told as a kid was that a perfectly proportioned, really small human was considered a midget. Was that right? Yeah. And then a dwarf was someone that was having the more proportional distortion. Don't mean if anybody, but that's what I was told, and whatever. It's never said in any derogatory manner. But it wasn't either one of those. It wasn't super duper tattoo tiny. But I'm telling you, like, the average height was probably about 4'11" at the most. The other than them being completely proportional, the fascinating thing was they were wearing absolutely modern clothing, like jeans and just really nice clothes. And they were built absolutely perfect for these folks. The other thing that was interesting is they had some kids running around, probably 2 kids. And they were utterly tiny. I mean, there are German couples that have babies as tall as these kids. And they're perfectly fine. These kids are running around having a good time. And it was an odyssey. It was fascinating. And I remember, I think I even whispered to my girlfriend, I said, look, man, that couple is really small, man. And it just never left me. It was fascinating. It was positive, So, and I'm thinking, okay, they're Latin. And so, the story I was always told in history books was that when the conquistadors came over to South America, they started breeding with these individuals, and that's where you get some of the hybrid races that exist in the northern part of South America. It makes sense. That's what we do. We're breeding all the time. We're making all kinds of hybrid versions of ourselves, right? Which makes the world pretty cool, right? So for the rest of my life, until someone presents a tremendous amount of counter evidence, I will always believe that giant humans did exist on this planet, that pygmies existed, and mainly because of the graves found in Tennessee and Kentucky. What's a little confusing is that you want to find visual proof these days, right? We're spoiled that way. Nothing wrong with that. I have seen, especially during these documentaries that I'll watch online, or videos, I should say, but these are by accredited anthropologists, not just a person like me regurgitating things to you. But I'll see these photographs of sort of patinaed skeletons, all brown, almost like they've been glazed or something to protect them. And they are tiny humans. Now, you'll remember that Dr. Stephen Greer did his movie, I think Sirius, something like that. And in his movie, they have what they said was an alien. And it definitely was like a little sort of almond-eyed looking skull. And it was utterly teeny tiny. I mean, it was like, it could fit in a shoebox. And it was supposedly held in a mission by a priest, and that this had gone on, like they had possession of this little human body, or whatever it was, for over 70 years or something like that. Could have even been longer. Who knows, right? So they buy it off of this guy, or whoever ended up having it, and they had it analyzed. And the interesting thing was that the counter theories that this was not an alien was that it was a fetus that had somehow come into this world early, and that maybe they kept it to honor it or something like that. And then they actually ended up doing a bunch of physical analysis to this skeleton. And the only thing that I think, when they did the DNA test on it, they said, definitely human. Now, here's the thing. When you got a bunch of guys running around confiscating skeletons of both the little folks that we find and the big folks we find, inhibiting that research against Stephen Greer's theory is very plausible, right? Well, don't say it's a freaking alien, man. We don't want that whole thing to come out until the Pentagon wants to do it in 2021. I think the only thing that was, if I have this right, I apologize if I get this wrong. I think the only thing they thought was sort of non-human was the construction of the eye. There were certain little layers of how the eye was composed that, or some tissue near the eye, because the eye should be gone, right? Something in the head area. I probably just butchered that horribly, but there was something about it that they said was not necessarily human, that it's not indicative of human development. Now, here's the thing. I personally don't know of all the microscopic evolutional steps of a human body. I don't mean to say evolutional, but I mean like within the womb of a mother and a baby developing over 9 months, as to whether or not some of these phases change and deteriorate to the point where we don't ever find them in birthed humans, such that if we were to take a baby out at 4 months, there's a bunch of things that are different. I mean, your ears supposedly start on your cheeks and work their way back to your ear, which is why there's that deformity where ears get stopped. One of my best friends when I was a little kid had an ear that didn't quite make it back, and it didn't fully develop, so it never had an ear hole. Paul Stanley from Kiss has, I believe, his right ear isn't fully formed, which was, I think, the same ear my buddy had. My buddy had a bunch of other issues that had to be fixed the second he was born. So, tell me what you know about other evidence, if there's something big, especially that I overlooked. I have to say the comments are off the hook nowadays. I mean, I always say that from time to time, but you guys are on fire right now. I mean, the amount of comments that are to me that are just mind-blowing, like the Cairo meaning Mars thing. I mean, we do know that they worship, a black box all over the planet. There's weird meteorites they worship. I'm not sure what that's all about. It's fascinating. It's not as intoxicating for me as the pyramids not being in any of the hieroglyphs, but it's a pretty good second. I think at this point, because there has been a conspiracy against man to confiscate all of these skeletons and take them away, that we have a problem with them coming out and saying, we did that. It'd be tough for them to come out and say, okay, let's disclose all this stuff. Everyone's fine with that. It would obviously disrupt some of the power structures of religion, potentially. And, when we talk about churches destroying history, some of you get it right away, and some of you have already gotten it many years ago, and some of you don't get it. And I understand, man, I didn't get it for a really long time myself, probably damn near 40 years. It has to do with control, right? I mean, I won't turn this into some huge negative tailspin here, but it does have to do with monetary control. I mean, imagine, the Catholic Church is the biggest real estate owner on planet Earth, which I think is probably second to the Queen of England's family. So, I mean, there's a lot of real estate. There's they don't get taxed. They do always collect a stipend from their followers, one way or the other. And imagine that crumbles, and then everybody goes, tax those people. Then all these folks that run that organization lose all their power structure. They lose access to little kids. And so I understand why there's nonsensical control mechanisms all over the place. Expanding Earth reveals a whole bunch that if you just do a little bit more research, it'll show you that crude oil is a natural byproduct of the Earth's plasma core. It's not a fossil fuel. It doesn't mean we should start burning a bunch of oil. It just means we got it all wrong. Pangea drift goes away. And so you learned about the Pedro projection map of the Earth, where all the globes in the world are wrong. The state of Massachusetts is now replacing the crappy globes with good globes. It's generally very similar to what you've seen, but all the continents are actually stretched vertically a lot more than the way we see them on globes today. And I'm going to throw a little bonus round in here. It's a non sequitur, but it has to do with the globe. And again, forgive me, flat earthers. When was the moon thing? Because I keep listening to that moon episode, I'm thinking, damn it, I forgot to mention this, I forgot to mention that. And then I try to mention, I butcher the sentences. Millimeters, not centimeters. When they took the blue marble shot from Apollo 17 coming back to Earth, supposedly, right? Complete hoax, right? It's the continent of Africa with Madagascar off to the side and the Black Sea across the top. There's two huge problems. In fact, there's actually three problems with that shot. The first problem is the first time that shot ever showed up in the history books, the Black Sea is all screwed up. It's all zigzaggy. It's literally got the top part hitting the bottom part, and it just looks like the Great Lakes. It's not the way it is. It's actually a fully open container of the Black Sea. Well, they eventually fixed the shot and republished it and never told anybody they lied. This other dude spun Google Earth to the exact same perspective as the shot was taken and found out that Africa is the total wrong proportion to the wrong proportion globe that we all have, and Madagascar is in the wrong place. It's actually much further down. That's the second problem. Now, when you know the Pedro projection map issue, you realize we got the globes wrong. So even more distortion would be added to that picture if it was actually from space. So there's your little bonus fact about the moon. If you haven't seen episode 520 and you think we went to the moon, do yourself a favor and eat a big bag of truth. And if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, that's where everything is, the audio, the video. But I've made one little addition to the site, which I think is going to be very powerful. I've had limited time in the last week to really put a tremendous amount of information in it. But for those of you who visited in the last week, and this is the 21st of April, I put a new section on there, which is suggested content. I was going to do just videos, but I want to add a bunch of other content in there. So in the future, as I tell you about videos that I watch to do research for something, instead of me just pointing it in some descriptor down below, you can go to the site and there's a whole new section in there where I will write a little tiny editorial usually about what the video is, because the video is usually self-explanatory. But I've got Bart Sabrell's movies up there. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Astronauts Gone Wild. But I'm going to start putting some of the Uncharted X stuff in there, Brian Forrester stuff in there. So as I tell you about this stuff and you want to go deep dive, you won't have to remember what I said. You'll just go to the website and click on it and enjoy yourself. And that way, they can't gag your feed. If you're not getting what you want on your feed on your TV, just pull up your laptop, your telephone, and get in there and have fun. If the video is only accessible on BitChute, well, you don't need to worry about it. I got it all handled for you. Or Vimeo, whatever it is, right? But yeah, we have audio, video, social media, all new remastered season 1, a store, and a couple ways to donate. For all of you that do donate on Patreon, thank you so much. Again, we've run into some hard drive issues this year. Surprise, surprise. It's all handled now. I'm so happy. Everything's all double backed up now. So you guys saved the day. Anyhow, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next Deep Thoughts. Over now. For all of you, if I could learn how to speak English, it'd be just awesome.